Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of the Affluent Society. Our question to think about here is, how does the term suburbia represent both a place and a state of mind? When we talk about suburbia, we're talking about the suburbs, those suburban communities on the outskirts of the cities. Because there was a housing shortage in most American cities, the most logical place to build new houses was just outside the cities, in these suburbs. Also, during this time period, housing developers discover that if they employ almost like an assembly line technique to the production of houses, that they can build these houses very quickly and efficiently. So William Levitt in New York is probably the best known of these urban developers. And so in Long Island, New York, we have a suburb known as Levittown. It sits on about 6,000 acres and contains about 17,000 houses. The way that Levitt made this possible is all of these houses looked exactly the same. They had the same floor plan. So your builders start at the foundation and simply go down the block and onto the next block with each stage. So you start with the foundation and the plumbing, you move up into the framing, and then putting the outer part of the house on, and then finishing the inside. Thinking about it as an assembly line, you are able to build these houses really, really quickly and fairly cheaply. So for young couples, and again, coming back to the nuclear family, for these young couples, this was a brand new house that was pretty basic, but it was affordable. So the suburbs become an attractive option for many of these young couples looking to start their own families in their own homes. In addition to the housing developments, the Federal Highway Act of 1956 is going to contribute to the dramatic growth of the suburbs. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 creates the interstate highway system. Now, when you look at this map, you'll see the title at the top. It says the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. These highways were constructed, at least in part, in order to enable cities to evacuate their populations very quickly. Remember, we're in the Cold War. But most commonly, the highways are going to be used by people who are living in the suburbs and commuting into the cities. The car culture of the 1950s is going to develop partly because Americans have a love affair with cars. And in the 1950s, this blossoms. We have roughly 8 million cars on the roads by 1955. And just like today, cars of the 1950s represented a person's social status. It represented freedom and mobility along with personal identity. Related to the growth of the suburbs is the expansion of the middle class, because as the middle class grows, more and more people are going to be able to afford houses. Contributing to that is the GI Bill, or officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. That year is significant because it's before World War II is over. And the reason Congress passes this law is to correct an issue that was created after World War I. When World War I was over, all of the military personnel were sort of released back into the workforce, and it caused problems. It created unemployment. So given that the scope of World War II is much larger than American involvement in World War I, Congress recognized that we have to plan ahead for what happens when the war is over. And that's where the GI Bill comes in. The GI Bill provides money for veterans to attend college and vocational programs. And the idea here is, as military personnel are returning to the United States, not all of them would be immediately looking for jobs. Some of them would choose to go to college or go into a vocational program and even temporarily just delay their entrance into the workforce. In addition, for those who attended college, they wouldn't be competing with other men for jobs because they were in a different job category because of their education. So in this very important way, the GI Bill helps to democratize education. And what I mean by that is that you didn't have to be wealthy or privileged in order to attend college. It became something that average Americans could strive for and hope for. In addition, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 provides 5 million home loans for veterans. So not only do they move into the middle class because of their education, but they get the opportunity to buy a home, probably in those brand new suburbs. The expansion of the middle class is important for a number of reasons. Like we said, more people have access to home ownership, more people have access to education, but it also is going to lead to a homogenization of habits and values. Homogenization simply means a creation of sameness, so making things the same. And so when we think about the middle class, it's not just a dollar amount that you make each year that makes you middle class. It also has to do with habits and values. We often talk about the difference between white collar workers and blue collar workers. And an easy way to think about this is a blue collar worker is someone who gets their hands dirty at work. And a white collar worker is somebody who probably wears a button-up shirt and a tie and works in an office. So when we see the growth of the middle class after World War II, part of it comes from we have more white collar workers. Part of that is related again to the GI Bill, that you have more of these individuals going to college and more of them getting jobs in an office, management, sales, whatever. The other thing that goes along with this is that more and more blue-collar workers, especially factory workers, were beginning to adopt middle-class habits and values. And to give you a sense of this, what this looks like, I'm going to use the phrase, if you work hard, you will get ahead. That's a very middle-class concept because that doesn't apply to the wealthy. If you're the son of someone who is super rich, you don't have to work hard to get ahead. On the flip side, if you grow up in poverty, sometimes it doesn't matter how hard you work, you will not get ahead. So the belief in the statement, if you work hard, you will get ahead, is something very specific to the middle class. Related to all of this, the growth of suburbs, the nuclear family, the growth of the middle class, is the expansion of the American population. During the Great Depression, the marriage rate fell dramatically in the United States, and the birth rate fell dramatically because when we have hard economic times, people are less willing to bring more children into the world. And so when we take a look at the years after World War II, we see this phenomenal growth in the birth rate. And it's a clear signal that people were optimistic about the future of the economy. So the baby boomer generation is the generation born immediately after World War II is over. So 1946 to 1964. There was a 19% growth in the nation's population between 1950 and 1960. The baby boom generation encompasses 76 million people. The peak year of the baby boom was 1957, when 4.3 million babies were born in that 1 year. That amounts to one baby every 7 seconds in the United States. And what's interesting about this contributes to consumer demand for goods, especially baby-related products. So diapers, baby food, toys, medicine, schools, automobiles, books, teachers, furniture, housing. All of that demand is going to increase with the baby boom generation. And so much of the rest of the story of the 20th century is honestly the story of the baby boom generation. I hinted at it at the beginning of this topic that suburbia is not just a place, it's also a state of mind. And the rise of suburbs in the 1950s enhances a growing tendency toward conformity. Within all of this, we need to remember that we are in the midst of the Cold War. In fact, as we've seen in the late 1940s and early 1950s, these are some of the most tense years of the Cold War and the Second Red Scare. With McCarthyism running amok, nobody wants to stand out. So the focus becomes the nuclear family as opposed to the extended family, especially as people moved out of their ethnic neighborhoods in the cities and into these single family homes of the suburbs. And even if you had previously identified as Italian American or German American, the Cold War loosened those ethnic ties, and you did not teach your children the language of their grandparents because you wanted them to be American. You didn't want their loyalty or their identity to be questioned. In addition, religion, especially Protestant Christianity, is going to experience a revival, and it plays a role in this social homogeneity, this sameness. It sets Americans apart from the so-called godless communists. It's during this time that we add the words, "In God we trust," to our currency, and it's when we add the words, "Under God," to the Pledge of Allegiance. So whether it's living in the suburbs, having the same family type, moms stay at home, dads drive into the city and work in the office, all of the little boys are in Little League, all of the little girls are in Girl Scouts. And so there's a sense of sameness and conformity within suburbia. Consumer culture and mass media are definitely going to enhance this. This idea that if your neighbors get a new car every 2 years, then you need to buy a new car every 2 years to keep up. And the media reinforces that conformity with its advertising, with its programming, and through advertisements in magazines. Women are seeing a noticeable shift from what we saw before the war. During the 1950s, there was very little promotion of feminism. In fact, this has been going on for a little while, since the 1930s. World War II is kind of a little bit of a change with Rosie the Riveter, but with the baby boom, the emphasis on the family is going to reinforce the image of a woman as the caretaker of the home. During the 1950s, women are going to marry earlier than ever before, and they're going to have larger families. Now, ironically, the number of working women actually increases during this period, partly because the family needed that additional income in order to feed the growing consumerism of 1950s society. One final component here in the story of conformity has to do with the fact that racial minorities are not considered part of this story. In the 1950s, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the civil rights movement, but we are facing both de facto segregation and de jure segregation. So de facto segregation is in fact, and de jure means by law. So some of these suburbs, when they were constructed, had policies that didn't allow African Americans or other minorities from buying a house there. So even if these cities were in the north, and a great example of this is Levittown. In 1953, Levittown had a population of 70,000 without a single African American resident. So these suburbs were deliberately excluding minorities. So coming back to our questions to think about, how does the term suburbia represent both a place and a state of mind? We see the dramatic growth of the suburbs because of the housing developments like Levittown and the Federal Highway Act of 1956, making living in the suburbs and working in the cities convenient. But it's also a state of mind. If we consider it within the context of the Cold War, suburbia contributes to the sameness. These young families with children that looked exactly like their neighbors. White, middle class, young, exactly the same. So stay tuned for part 3 of the Affluent Society.